better stewards of federal education money. On behalf of the students, we have to improve a system that may or may not prepare them for a career and may or may not lead to a degree, but almost in every case leads to debt. Mr. President, I ask consent that the following statement be placed as a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week USA Today published an article that highlights the stories of people and families hurt by taking dietary supplements containing the chemical DNP. It's a hazardous pesticide, this DNP, that was used as a weight loss drug before 1938. Then the FDA declared it to be toxic for humans in 1938, 75 years ago. The article in USA Today featured Matt Cahill, a dietary supplement manufacturer with a high school education and no chemistry training, who illegally added this toxic pesticide, DNP, to exercise and weight loss supplements. Some people who used his products suffered liver failure, some died. Cahill was arrested, criminally prosecuted, and served time in prison. But he's back, selling dietary supplements that raise more health concerns. The article in USA Today raised serious questions about whether we can do better to protect the American public. Now, dietary supplements have become a common health aid in medicine cabinets. More than half of Americans use dietary supplements, and you may be one of them. Most supplement makers are ethical and responsible. I take a multivitamin every day and believe it's safe. But most people assume that supplements on the shelves in stores have been tested by the federal government. How could they get on a shelf without a test? Most people think, like drugs that are prescribed, these supplements are tested for safety and effectiveness. That's not true. Unlike more traditional supplements like calcium and vitamin C, there are now many new and complex supplements on the market promising to help people lose weight, find energy, bulk up, prevent disease, you name it. Consumers need to be careful. If a product is promising something too good to be true, they need to make sure the product and its ingredients are safe. We need to know the information on the label is not misleading. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, needs to know more about these products. This week, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut and I are reintroducing the Dietary Supplement Labeling Act. Listen to what this bill would require. This bill would require more information on labels of dietary supplements, and it would help ensure that the FDA has the information it needs if it turns out any of these products are dangerous. Many people would be surprised to learn that the FDA does not even know how many dietary supplements are being sold in this country. The USA Today article clearly states that when this Cahill character first sold his harmful dietary supplement tainted with DNP, he sold it online. FDA had no idea it was even on the market. How does FDA learn when a product's on the market? People get sick and they die. Another example is kava, a root whose extract people take to alleviate anxiety. But now that we know that kava is associated with severe liver damage and death, it will be useful for the FDA to have information readily available about the products on the market in America today containing kava. Our bill would require dietary supplement makers to give the FDA the name of each supplement they produce, along with the description of the product, a list of ingredients, and a copy of the label. Is that too much to ask? If you're going to sell this dietary supplement in stores across America, shouldn't the Food and Drug Administration at least have a copy of the label and the ingredients? With this information, the FDA would know what products are on the market, what ingredients are in them, and be able to work with supplement manufacturers to address any problems. This is a common sense provision. It's supported by the Consumers Union and already practiced by many responsible supplement makers. Let's ask all the companies to provide FDA this basic information. In addition to asking manufacturers to tell the FDA when a product goes on the market, this bill would require more information on the label of these products. Some ingredients may be safe for the general population, but not for kids or pregnant women, or perhaps those who have a compromised health condition. St. John's wort is used safely by many people, but it can cause serious side effects in people who have ADHD, or people who are bipolar, or people who are undergoing surgery. Information like that should be clearly listed on the label. This bill would help to ensure the information necessary to make an informed decision by consumers. Now, we've all seen claims in supplement stores. I was in Ogilvie train station Saturday night with my wife and went into one of these dietary supplement stores, and the shelves were just packed with all these products claiming all these things. Some of them promise they'll boost your immunity, enhance your athletic performance, or make you a better husband. This bill would give the FDA the authority to require a manufacturer to provide upon request the evidence to support claims such as promotes weight loss. Consumers should be skeptical of any product making big claims, and they should take time to learn if the product's safe and effective. But we need to give the FDA the authority to request evidence to support any claims made on these labels. The bill would also help curb the growing practice of foods and beverages with potentially unsafe ingredients masquerading as dietary supplements by directing the FDA to establish a definition for conventional foods. I'll challenge you, whether it's West Virginia or Illinois or Washington, D.C. or your home state. Go to the cash register at the gas station. What's the first thing you'll see next to the cash register? Energy supplements, those little red bottles. They're everywhere. Products like energy drinks, the small ones, and the huge one in 24 and 32-ounce cans, and baked goods like Mellow Munchies brownies contain unapproved food additive melatonin, are marketed as dietary supplements that are safe ways to get a boost of energy or even to relax, when in reality they are foods and beverages taking advantage of the more relaxed regulatory standards for dietary supplements. So here's a quiz. Did you know that the Food and Drug Administration regulates a food product known as cola? You pick it, Pepsi, Coca-Cola. Did you know that the Food and Drug Administration, in regulating that food product, says how much caffeine they can put in each bottle of cola? They do. But when it comes to the Monster energy drinks, if you pull out your magnifying glass and go to the back and look very closely, you'll notice that it isn't listed as a food product. It's called a dietary supplement. And what are the regulations on limitations of caffeine in Monster energy drinks? None. Nada. I had a sad case here recently in Virginia. A girl who was 15 or 16 years old, 2 24-ounce high-powered energy drinks in a 24-hour period of time, and she died. Died from 2 energy drinks. Way too much caffeine for a person her age and her size. I'm working with Senator Blumenthal to try to get the FDA to establish some standards here. These are not benign products. They're certainly not benign products for young people. And if they're consumed in quantity, they're dangerous. People get sick and people die. I've had press conferences in Chicago with emergency room physicians. You would be shocked to know how many people show up having taken these energy drinks and consumed too much caffeine and worried that they're about to die. That is a reality. And it's time for us to establish some standards to protect consumers and families. Now, most dietary supplements available today are safe and are used by millions of Americans as part of a healthy lifestyle. As I've said and will repeatedly, I take my fish oil, I take my multivitamin. I don't believe I should have to get a prescription to buy them. But we also need to regulate we also need to recognize how the regulation of supplements can be improved to protect the public in America. In the USA Today article, a representative from the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, a nonprofit designated by Congress to oversee testing of those who participate in the Olympics and other athletes, said that companies like Matt Cahill's, and I'll quote, are not fringe players. These are mainstream dietary supplement companies and products that are in your mainstream health and nutrition stores. It's not that there are a few bad actors. There are a lot of bad actors. Ensuring the health of consumers from these bad actors will take cooperation from responsible people in the dietary supplement industry, the Food and Drug Administration, and Congress and both political parties. Senator Blumenthal and I have put in a bill which includes common sense steps to make sure risks for supplements are on the label, products are registered with the FDA, and manufacturers can be forced to back up their big claims. I look forward to working with my colleagues to enact that legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended. I also ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business and to engage in a colloquy with my Republican colleagues.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
reserving the right to object, and I don't intend to object. I'd like to modify his unanimous consent request that I follow for 15 minutes after his colloquy.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I rise in support of parents, families, students, employees, taxpayers, and other hardworking Americans who, as of January 1st, 2014, will find themselves unfairly impacted by Obamacare, an ill-conceived, poorly crafted, and economically damaging piece of legislation. We've known for some time now that Obamacare would create a set of circumstances that would make health care unaffordable. It's unaffordable from several standpoints. Number one, for the country, for the United States government. The Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan entity, recently reported that this law is likely to cost the United States government about $1.8 trillion over the next 10 years. Significantly more, some would say roughly double what the initial estimates given to Congress were when this law was passed. This is an enormous amount of money, especially an enormous amount of money for a government that's now $17 trillion in debt and is adding to that debt at a rate of about $1 trillion every single year. It's not as though we have an overabundance of money within the federal government. It's not as though we can afford to be taking on newer, more expensive programs like this one, especially when they run price tags that are substantially above and beyond what they were presented to us with. It's also something that's proving to be unaffordable for American families. There are a number of studies that have been conducted in recent months that tell us that premiums are going to become more expensive. The name of the law, of course, was the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This implies, of course, that this would protect patients and it would make health care more affordable, not less. And what we've found is that this is a misnomer. What we've found through these studies that have been released recently is that it's going to make health care less affordable for American families and not more. Now, the interesting thing about these studies, Mr. President, is that they're all over the map. We don't know exactly how much health care is going to cost us. We don't know exactly how much less affordable health care will become under the Affordable Care Act because there are so many uncertainties created by this law. The 2,700-page bill that became Obamacare has been modified and will continue to be modified by countless pages, tens of thousands of pages of regulations. This act has also been modified in significant ways on a couple of occasions, which we will get to in a minute. But all of these modifications have created additional uncertainty that really is a source of a lot of concern to a lot of Americans. But what we do know is that it is likely to result in premium increases. So one study concluded that even on the low end, the increased premiums that families would be paying in a small group premium context would go up between 13% and 23% on average. Other studies, including one that was conducted in the state of Indiana, suggested that premiums would go up in that state by 72% for those with individual plans. I'm told that Maryland's biggest health insurance provider has proposed raising premiums for individual policies by an average of 25% next year. For young people, these numbers are in many instances even worse, and they're also numbers that suggest there's a lot of uncertainty that we really don't know. It's almost impossible to know. An analysis of more than 30 studies has showed that premiums are likely to increase for young people seeking health insurance between 145 and 189%. In Utah, my state, there's a study suggesting that for young people seeking health insurance, their premiums are likely to increase between 56 and 90% with respect to individual policies. This law is also bad for America's workers. Businesses are cutting hours. They're moving workers to part-time, and in many cases, they're not hiring at all. According to a recent U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey, 74% of businesses will fire employees or they'll cut hours. 61% will not hire next year. Daniel Kessler, who's a professor of law and business at Stanford University, has predicted that 30 to 40 million Americans will be directly harmed by Obamacare through higher premiums, stiff penalties, cutbacks in hours, and job losses. So again, Mr. President, we've known for some time as a result of these studies that Obamacare was going to make health care unaffordable. We now know it is also going to be unfair, fundamentally unfair. This because the President recently admitted that the law is not ready for prime time. He admitted that he's not ready to implement the law as it's been written, and that because Obamacare was so poorly crafted, he's simply not going to enforce it the way it was crafted. He's going to selectively enforce its provisions. Most importantly, Mr. President, the President of the United States has said that while he's going to require hardworking Americans, individuals, to comply with the law's individual mandate, a provision of the law that, according to one recent study, only 12% of the American people actually support today, he is going to implement and enforce that provision. But at least for the first year of the law's full effect next year, he won't be implementing, he will not be enforcing the employer mandate. So hardworking Americans have to comply, big business doesn't. This is significant because the law doesn't give the President of the United States the power to rewrite the law. The law sets forth a specific set of timelines, a specific set of deadlines that cause the law's various provisions to kick in. This did not give the President the authority or the discretion to decide which, among the law's several provisions, could be favored or disfavored by the President of the United States. And so you've got hardworking Americans, individuals and families on the hook, and you've got big business being thrown a big bone. This is not fair. This is not something that is consistent with the rule of law. This is not something that the American people ought to tolerate. So the Affordable Care Act, as it's called, will shatter not only our hard-earned health benefits, but it will, in many instances, destroy the foundation of the 40-hour work week that's become the backbone of the American middle class. And it will do all of this in a way that will contribute to and be part of a system of selective, unfair enforcement. The American people deserve better. The American people demand better. And the American people deserve not to have this law implemented and enforced if, as the President of the United States has told us, it's not ready for prime time. It's not ready to be implemented. And so I would ask of my friend and my colleague, the distinguished junior senator from Florida, how he feels about this and how the people in his state, the state of Florida, feel about the selective implementation and enforcement of a law that Americans already knew was going to be unaffordable and a law that they now know will also be unfair.
Well, I want to thank the senator from Utah. Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank the senator from Utah for organizing this effort. And let me answer that question by coming up with a couple of things that I think we can find some consensus on. The first thing is that I think all of us would agree that the American middle class is one of the things that makes us exceptional. I like to say every country in the world has rich people. Unfortunately, every country in the world has people that are struggling. But what has made America unique and different from all these other countries is that we have this vibrant middle class. People that work hard, they make enough money to own a home and take their kids on vacation and save for their college expenses and kind of fulfill many of their dreams. I grew up in that environment. I tell people all the time I didn't have everything I wanted, but we always had everything we needed because we, through hard work and sacrifice, my parents became part of that great American middle class, working class Americans who had the opportunity to give us the life they never had. So I think we can all agree that the middle class is really important for America because it's one of the things that makes us exceptional and unique and sets us apart from the rest of the world. Quite frankly, it's one of the reasons why people want to live here and love being in America, because it creates those opportunities. Now, what strengthens the middle class? And we're having a debate about that in this country. What strengthens the middle class? Is it a bunch of government spending? Is it a bunch of government programs? Is it U.S. senators? Is it the President of the United States? The answer, no. What actually makes the middle class possible, vibrant, broad middle class, is jobs that pay middle class salaries. That's what makes it possible, is you have jobs that pay that kind of money so that people can join the middle class and give their kids a better life. And where do those jobs come from? Do they come from the government? Do they come from the White House? Do they come from the U.S. Senate or from our laws? They don't. They come from a vibrant private economy that's creating those jobs. And how those jobs are created is not that complicated. One of two things has to happen for jobs to be created. Number one, people need to start new businesses, or number two, they need to grow a business that already exists. Those are the two primary ways in which middle-class jobs, in fact, most jobs, are created outside of government. We're the only place we're going to find the kind of growth that we need for a vibrant middle class. So we should analyze every issue before this body through the lens of the middle class and through the lens of whether it makes it easier or harder for someone to start a business or grow an existing one. And so let's examine what you just asked me about Obamacare in the context of that. And the answer is that it is clear that Obamacare makes it harder for people to start a business or grow an existing one for a number of reasons that you've pointed out. Number one, it has an incentive for your business not to grow. It tells you if you have more than X number of employees, more than 50 full-time employees, you will have to meet these sets of rules, which will make it very expensive for you to start a business or grow an existing business. The other thing it creates is a tremendous amount of uncertainty. It goes back to the point you just raised. These laws are being canceled on a whim. The President is deciding we're going to enforce this part of it, but not that part of it. So what that creates is confusion. Imagine now if you've got a business and you've got some money set aside to grow, you don't know how much it's going to cost to grow. So you know what you do? You don't grow. And as a result, those jobs are not created. How about the cost of that insurance? An issue you talked about a moment ago, Senator Lee. The senator from Utah described this. In Florida, just yesterday, the Commissioner of Insurance said that in the individual marketplace in Florida next year, because of Obamacare, rates are going up 30 to 40%. Ask yourself, does that make it easier to start a new business, or does it make it harder? Does it make it easier to grow an existing business, or does it make it harder? And think about the impact this is going to have on middle-class workers. All of this uncertainty. Add to this the following. Right now there's an incentive to have part-time workers, and that's why you're reading every day in the newspaper, Company X is moving people from full-time to part-time, from under 30 hours, so they can avoid the penalties in this bill. How about your insurance? Let's say you work somewhere now and you've got insurance and you're happy with it. This law might require your employer to basically put you on a new insurance or move you to a government exchange, which means that that doctor that you've been dealing with for 10 years who knows your case history, that may not be your doctor next year because of Obamacare. And the result is we have a holding pattern. Businesses in America, the people that create the middle-class jobs, are in a holding pattern, waiting to see what direction this goes. But they're all headed in a very poor direction because of this. And so when you talk about, and you ask the question, what impact am I hearing? That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that this law makes it harder for people to create jobs. This bill is going to make it harder on the middle class. It's going to make it harder for middle-class jobs to be created in America because it makes it harder to start a business and it makes it harder to grow an existing business. So I imagine the senator from Utah has heard similar concerns in his home state, and the senator from Texas has joined us here, a state even larger than mine, and in a moment I'm sure he'll share the input that he's getting from people in his home state and across the country. But, Senator, that's what I'm hearing from my constituents everywhere that I've been going in Florida over the last 6 months.
Will the senator yield for a unanimous consent request? It's my understanding that you have the floor occupied until 4:30, and will be recognized at that time. So I'd like to lock that in with the unanimous consent request. I'd be recognized at 4:30.
Mr. President,
Senator from
reserving the right to
Vermont.
object, and I understand the leader is about to make a request. I wonder if the senator could withhold his request for a couple of minutes.
Okay, I understand that, so I withdraw my request, and I'm going to use time perhaps tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Senator from Utah.
See, Mr. President, that we've been joined by my friend and colleague, the junior senator from Texas, and would like to ask him if his observations from his interactions with his constituents in Texas has been similar to those that have been shared today by the junior senator from Florida.
I want to thank the senator from Utah for his leadership on this issue. I am proud to stand with Senator Lee, with Senator Rubio, and with so many others. I can tell you in the state of Texas, Texans overwhelmingly understand that Obamacare isn't working, that this legislation is failing and it's hurting the American people. If you look at jobs, there is no legislation currently in effect that is damaging the economy more or damaging jobs more than Obamacare. In direct response to the law, 41% of small business owners have held off plans to hire new employees. 38% said they pulled back on plans to grow their businesses. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reports that 71% of small businesses say Obamacare makes it harder to hire workers. And beyond that, one of the most pernicious aspects of this law is it is forcing more and more employees to be moved to part-time employment, to be moved to working 29 hours a week or less to get under the Obamacare 30-hour threshold. In 2013, employers have added more part-time employees, averaging 93,000 a month, seasonally adjusted, than full-time workers. And it's important to understand who it is that's moved to part-time work, who it is that's hurt by Obamacare. It is the most vulnerable among us. It's not the CEOs. It's not the wealthy. It is young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms. According to the most recent census data in 2011, the poverty rate for those who work full-time was only 2.8%. The poverty rate for those working less than full-time year-round was 16.3%. Mr. President, I'm reminded of earlier in this year when we were debating the issue of Obamacare, and I read from a newspaper article out of the state of Oklahoma that quoted a single mom who's working at a fast food restaurant. And she and all of her coworkers had her hours forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week or less. And this single mom said, I got 2 little kids at home. I can't feed my kids on 29 hours a week, and neither can the other single moms that are struggling to make ends meet. Beyond the impact on jobs, on the economy, beyond those being forced into part-time work, we also have the compliance costs. According to federal agency estimates, Obamacare will add paperwork burdens totaling nearly 190 million hours or more every year. And, Mr. President, to put that in perspective, Mount Rushmore, which took 14 years to build, could be constructed 1,547 times with the paperwork Obamacare requires in 1 year. Not only do we see jobs being hurt, the economy being hurt, workers being hurt, hours being reduced, paperwork going up, but we're seeing premiums going up. Premiums going up far too high, and it's hitting those who are suffering the most. On Monday, Florida's insurance commissioner told the Palm Beach Post that insurance rates will rise by 5 to 20% in the small group market and by 30 to 40% in the individual market. Mr. President, to those who are at home in Florida watching what's happening, as they're seeing their insurance rates go up, they are going up because of the impact of this failed law. The Ohio Department of Insurance announced that Obamacare in Ohio will increase the individual market health premiums by 88%. Mr. President, if you're in Ohio right now and seeing your premiums go up, you can thank the men and women of the U.S. Congress. According to the Wyman firm, looking at young people in particular are hurt by Obamacare. The Wyman firm estimates that 80% of Americans aged 21 to 29 earning more than $16,000 will pay more out of pocket for coverage under Obamacare than they hurt today. Mr. President, if young people at home are watching this today and wondering about are they going to get a job, how are they going to climb the economic ladder, how are they going to achieve the American dream, Obamacare is driving up their health care premiums right now. And we all know that the President promised the American people at the time Obamacare was being debated, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. Mr. President, the facts have conclusively proven that wrong. According to a February 2013 report by the Congressional Budget Office, 7 million people will lose their employer-sponsored insurance. McKinsey & Company, a very well-regarded consulting firm, found that 30% of employers will definitely or probably stop offering health insurance in the years after 2014. Mr. President, this bill isn't working, and I would note that there is a growing bipartisan consensus on that front. As the facts have come in, the American people have kept an open mind, have looked at this bill and have seen that as it's being implemented, it's not working, it's hurting the economy, it's hurting jobs. According to an ABC Washington Post poll, in 2010, 74% of moderate and conservative Democrats. There are a significant number of Democrats that describe themselves as moderate or conservative. In 2010, 74% of them supported Obamacare. And yet in July, just 46% supported Obamacare. Not only that, we have seen the lead Senate author of Obamacare, a senior Democrat in this body, describe Obamacare as headed towards a, quote, huge train wreck. We have seen over and over again unions, which initially supported Obamacare, turning as they realize the consequences. So in April, the United Union of Roofers, Waterproofers, and Allied Workers called for, quote, repeal or complete reform of the Affordable Care Act to protect our employers, our industry, and our most important assets, our members and their family. Mr. President, if you listen to the voice of unions, unions are saying Obamacare is failing, it's not working. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers released a white paper in July explaining that Obamacare, quote, threatens to harm our members by dismantling multi-employer health plans. And then, really quite striking, James Hoffa, Jr., the president of the Teamsters Union, wrote a letter to Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi stating that Obamacare, quote, will destroy the very health and well-being of our members along with millions of other hardworking Americans. Why? Well, Mr. Hoffa explained that Obamacare is destroying the 40-hour work week that has been the backbone of the American middle class. Mr. President, if you trust the voices of unions, Mr. President, if you have a concern for the American middle class, then listen to the bipartisan voices that are rising up saying Obamacare isn't working. And most strikingly, Mr. President, we have President Obama himself, who just a few weeks ago was forced to unilaterally and without legal authority delay implementation of Obamacare for large corporations. For companies with more than 50 employees, he unilaterally moved the employer mandate until after the next election. Now, Mr. President, I would suggest there are at least two things we can derive from President Obama's decision to do that. Number one, if Obamacare were a good thing, if it were working, we can be sure President Obama would want it to go into full effect before the next election. He would want to take credit with the American people for the benefits of this signature bill. The fact that the President was forced to concede the wheels are coming off and to move the employer mandate until after the next election, I would suggest is highly, highly revealing. But number two, Mr. President, it raises the obvious follow-up question. Why is President Obama willing to grant a waiver for giant corporations, but not for hardworking American families, not for the men and women who are struggling to make ends meet, who are climbing the economic ladder, who want, like our parents and grandparents before them, to achieve the American dream? Obamacare is standing in their way. So what are we to do about it? Well, Mr. President, the most important constitutional check and balance that Congress has on an overreaching executive is the power of the purse. And the framers of the Constitution wisely gave authority over expenditures of money to the United States Congress, and that is why the senator from Utah, the senator from Florida, and I, along with many others, are standing together and saying, this isn't working, and Congress should defund it. In 62 days, the continuing resolution which funds the federal government will expire. Each of the three of us, along with a number of others, have publicly stated, under no circumstances will we support a continuing resolution that funds 1 penny of Obamacare. If 41 members of this body stand together and make that same statement, or if 218 members in the House of Representatives stand together and take that same position, we can do something different than we've seen this year. The past couple of years, we've seen 39, 40, 41 votes to repeal Obamacare, all of which have been effectively symbolic, because none of them had a real chance of passage. Mr. President, with the continuing resolution, we have a chance to successfully defund Obamacare. Now, right now, we don't have the votes in this institution. If the vote were held today, we would not hold 41 senators to defund Obamacare. But we've got 62 days until September 30th, and every one of us takes very seriously our obligation to represent our constituents. And if in the next 62 days we see what I believe we're going to see, which is the American people rising up en masse, hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans standing up saying, it isn't working, it's hurting our jobs, it's hurting our economy, it's hurting our health care, it's making our lives worse, stand up and defund it. If enough Americans speak out and demand of their elected officials that we do the right thing, Mr. President, I'm confident we will. I'm confident Republicans will. And I am hopeful that members of the Democratic Party will as well, that every one of us, Mr. President, I believe the American people should hold their elected officials accountable, and that most assuredly includes me, it includes all of us. We should be held accountable by our constituents, and the American people know this bill isn't working. There's bipartisan agreement on it, and we have a potential in the next 62 days to show real leadership, not to give a speech, not to give a meaningless symbolic vote, but if we stand together to actually defund it. And let me make one final point. which is those who disagree with the position that is being taken by Senator Lee and Senator Rubio and myself, say that taking this stand will mean that Republicans will be blamed for a government shutdown. Well, let me be clear what I think should happen. I believe the House of Representatives should pass a continuing resolution, should fund the entirety of the federal government except for Obamacare, and should explicitly prohibit further funding of Obamacare, should adopt the legislation that I've introduced as a condition to the continuing resolution. Now, the next step, there will be partisan critics who immediately charge Republicans with threatening to shut down the government. And, Mr. President, I would suggest that we then take the argument to the American people, that it is the American people that should decide if there are members of this body who are willing to shut down the American government in order to force Obamacare down the throats of the American people, in order to say President Obama will grant a waiver to giant corporations but not to hardworking American families. Let's take that argument to the American people, because I think the American people want economic growth back. That should be our top priority. Nothing is killing jobs more. Nothing is hurting the American economy more than Obamacare. There's bipartisan agreement on that, and I am hopeful that members of this body will stand and lead, and I thank the senator from Utah for taking the lead on what I believe is the most important battle that this Congress will confront.
Those of us who share this position feel strongly that it is indisputably, constitutionally, the prerogative of the United States Congress to exercise the power of the purse. This means that we don't have to vote to fund something with which we fundamentally disagree. Some have suggested that because this was passed by Congress 3 years ago, we somehow have an obligation to fund it. Well, I remind my colleagues who might make that statement that the Congress as it existed then is not the same Congress as it exists today. That was 2 Congresses ago. The Congress that enacted that law was fundamentally changed in part because it enacted that law. The law has not been popular. It has not been good to those who voted to enact it. Ever since the majority party in the House of Representatives changed hands after the 2010 election, due in large part to Obamacare, there have been a lot of people who have suggested the Republicans in Congress need to defund Obamacare's implementation and enforcement. For a variety of reasons, that hasn't happened. We've continued to pass continuing resolutions with no restrictions on Obamacare's implementation and enforcement, at least as it relates to the ultimate implementation and enforcement of the exchanges, of the individual mandate, and so forth. Republicans have had reasons for doing this. Some of those reasons have included the statement to the effect that, well, the Supreme Court's going to knock it down. It'll strike it down. It'll invalidate Obamacare because it's unconstitutional. Of course it is, and a majority of the Supreme Court concluded that it was unconstitutional as written. But the Supreme Court, rather than invalidate it, instead rewrote the law not just once but twice in order to save it. Some Republicans have also justified continuing to vote for funding bills that contain Obamacare implementation revenue, money, funding, because they believed the Republican president would be elected in 2012 and would stop Obamacare. Well, that didn't happen either. We've got one last opportunity to defund the implementation of this law before these provisions that I just mentioned kick in on January 1st. One last opportunity, and that's in connection with our current spending bill, our current continuing resolution that is set to expire on September 30th, just 62 days from right now. So what we're saying is that if you agree with us, if you agree with the President that this law is not ready to be implemented as it was written, as it was enacted by Congress, if the President's not going to follow the law, then the American people shouldn't have to fund it. If you don't like it, if you agree that it's not ready, don't fund it. We can, and we should, and we must fund government, but not Obamacare. So I'd ask the senator from Florida if these are sentiments that are consistent with what you have been thinking, sentiments that are consistent with what you've been hearing from your constituents in Florida.
Well, Mr. President,
Senator from Florida.
In response to the senator from Utah, I would say I have. Because I think there's a pretty clear understanding growing every day, as evidenced by the senator from Texas a moment ago, went through all these groups out there, including labor unions, that have now turned on Obamacare because what it means to their members. So it's increasingly established how much damage this law is doing. The question I get to the senator from Utah, I'd say, is what can we do about it? There's almost this resignation by people that, well, what can we do about this? I mean, it's already in place, and is there anything we can do? So I think there's three things that we should be able to do, and I'll summarize those fairly quickly. The first thing we should do is not continue to double and triple down on this thing. And I think that both the senator from Texas and senator from Utah grew up at the same time as I did, so they will remember something that a lot of the younger people here probably do not remember. There was a time when Coca-Cola came out with something called New Coke. It was a new Coca-Cola formula. After about 100-something years, they changed the formula of Coca-Cola, and they came out with something called New Coke. It was a disaster. Everybody hated it. In fact, they hated it because they said if we wanted to drink something that had that much, that kind of sweet, there's other options on the market. We like old Coke. What did Coca-Cola do when New Coke began to flounder? They didn't say, well, we're just going to continue to make more of it. They backed away from it. They went back to the original formula. They learned from their mistake, and they didn't double down. That's the way it is in the real world. That's the way it is in our lives, and that's the way it is in the private sector, but not government, not Washington. In Washington, if something is going wrong, here they double and triple down. It's like an invitation to move forward. We shouldn't do that. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is we've got to stop this from moving forward. The implications of this law are already being felt, but the regulations around this law, the mandates in this law, the fees and the costs and the new rate increases in this law, those things, you're only going to start to feel that right now. In the next few months, you're going to really start to feel what this new law means to your life, to your business, to the place where you work. Now is the time to act. Which people ask, well, what is it? What can we do about it? Let me tell you what is probably not going to work in the short term. You're probably not going to get President Obama to sign a bill that repeals Obamacare. And you're not going to get the votes in the Senate to do that. So these repeal votes, I'll vote for every single one of them. But the problem is our chances of getting that accomplished are probably minimal so long as President Obama is the President of the United States. So truly, our last option is to stop paying for this thing. Why would we continue to pour billions and hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into a disaster? Why would we double down with your hard-earned money on a program that's going to hurt you? And we have a chance to do that in September, because in September, in order for the government to continue to function, we have to pass something called a short-term budget. I wish it was a permanent budget, but it's supposed to be a short-term budget. And all we're saying is, in that short-term budget, fund the government, keep the lights on, pay the military, make sure Social Security checks go out. The only thing you shouldn't do is you should not fund and pay for Obamacare. The pushback we get from that from some people is, well, that's crazy, because that means you're willing to shut down the government over Obamacare. That's not the way I see it. The way I see it is, if we pass a budget that pays for everything except for Obamacare, and the President says he'll veto that, it is he who wants to shut down the government. It is he who is basically saying, I will shut down the government unless it pays for Obamacare. And that is an unreasonable position. It's unreasonable because this law is so bad. His own allies are coming to him and saying, please stop this from moving forward. Well, we're going to give you a chance, Mr. President, by refusing to fund it. And here's my last point. To my colleagues in the Republican Party, who I know every single one of the Senate members here of the Republican Party are against Obamacare. This is our last chance, our last best chance to do something about this. When this thing starts to kick in and starts to take root, it's going to be very difficult to undo major portions of this, despite the damage it's going to create. Now, I only speak for myself, although I think I can speak for the other two senators that have joined me here today in this effort. I want to be able to go back to Florida, no matter how this thing turns out, and say to the men and women who sent me here in 2010 that I did everything that I could to keep this from happening to you. When someone comes to me and says, I just got moved to part-time because of Obamacare, I want to be able to look them in the eye and say I did everything I could. When someone says to me, I just lost the insurance I was happy with, I now have this new insurance plan, which not that familiar with, and my doctor, who I've had for 30 years, isn't on that plan. I want to be able to say to them, I did everything I could. When someone comes to me and says, I have a pretty successful business, I've set some money aside, I was going to open a new business or grow this one, but I'm not because of Obamacare. I want to be able to say I did everything I could. And if we pass a budget in September that funds Obamacare, you did not do everything you could. You paid for this. You doubled down on it in ways that will have irreparable harm to our economy and to our country. This is our last best chance. And to those who say they're against Obamacare, I believe you. But let me tell you something. If we are not willing to draw a line in the sand on this issue, then what issue are we willing to lay a line in the sand on? If we're not willing to go to the limit on this issue, then what issue is there? Is there an issue that we are prepared to say we will not move forward because of this? Is there an issue that we are willing to do everything we can and lay it all on the line? Is there such an issue? And if it's not this one, which one is it? That's the choice before us. And I truly believe you cannot go back home and say you did everything you could to stop Obamacare if you vote for a budget that funds it. And I would ask the senator from Texas if he too shares those thoughts and those feelings.
Mr. President,
Sir.
I do indeed share those thoughts and feelings and the obligation that we owe to our constituents to honor our word and put action behind our words. And I would ask the senator from Utah if he would yield for a series of 3 short questions. The first question is, there has been much talk of a shutdown, and am I correct that we don't have to hypothesize what a shutdown would look like, that we have in fact seen that in 1995 with 2 temporary partial shutdowns that occurred when Republicans in the House stood up to President Clinton? And when that occurred in 1995, we saw several things. Number one, we saw the parade of horribles that is brought out did not occur. Social Security checks continued to flow, the military continued to be funded, interest on the debt continued to be paid, planes didn't fall out of the sky. And indeed, what occurs if Democrats decide to block a continuing resolution and force a temporary shutdown in order to force Obamacare on the American people is a partial temporary shutdown where non-essential government services get suspended for a period of time, not a shutdown of essential services such as paying for the men and women who are fighting for the military and providing Social Security checks, and we have seen that in the past. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct, and it's how it has happened in the past. This is not something we want. This is not something we've threatened. This is something that we think can and should be avoided and that we want to avoid. In the unfortunate, completely avoidable event that that did happen, it would be largely as you described.
A second question I would ask is this week we saw the rather stunning news that the IRS Employees Union, the men and women at the IRS charged with enforcing Obamacare, are asking not to be made subject to Obamacare. Indeed, the union leaders have sent to their union members draft letters to send members of this body saying, we, the IRS Employees Union, do not want to be subject to Obamacare. Likewise, Obamacare subjects members of this body and their staffs to Obamacare. And I am not aware of a single Senate office that is not deeply concerned about that is not facing the prospect of staff quitting the congressional offices because the harms of Obamacare are so significant. And there have been many a panic discussion among Democrats and Republicans about what to do about subjecting members and their staff to Obamacare. And my question, my second of 3 short questions, is what does it say to you that the IRS Employees Union is asking let us out from Obamacare, and that members and congressional staff are deeply concerned about the harms Obamacare is going to do to them?
Well, first of all, it tells me that those who are part of that union don't want to be subject to the same provisions of the same law that they will be enforcing. What it also tells me, in the bigger picture, is that above all, this law creates uncertainty. That's why we see so much angst among people right here on Capitol Hill, who are facing the very real prospect, the very real future in the next few months of going on to these exchanges. Because nobody knows what this is going to look like. Nobody has any idea. One thing Americans really don't like in this world of a lot of unavoidable uncertainties are more uncertainties heaped upon them by dictate of the federal government. We've got enough uncertainties in life. We don't know when somebody's going to get sick. We don't know when accidents are going to happen. So we should be able to avoid those things that government thrusts upon us. This is one of the many reasons why there's so much angst within IRS and within the ranks of the Capitol Hill workforce. People don't want to go on to these exchanges because they have absolutely no idea what this is going to look like.
And my third brief question is for those in this body who have campaigned at home, who have told their constituents they're opposed to Obamacare. On January 1st, the exchanges go up and running, the subsidies begin, and the history of the modern entitlement state is that any time a subsidy has been put in place, it is proven politically virtually impossible to undo. Indeed, no major entitlement that has been implemented in modern times has ever been undone. For those who say they oppose Obamacare, what is the alternative to defunding Obamacare with the continuing resolution? And let me ask it a separate way. If we do not defund it, am I correct that come January 1, Republicans will essentially be surrendering that in all likelihood Obamacare will be a permanent feature of the economy, hurting jobs, hurting low-income workers, hurting our health care system? And if that's correct, has any reasonable alternative been proffered by anyone on this side of the Senate to stop that harm other than what you and Senator Rubio and I and others are trying to do?
Based on historical precedent, we have every reason to believe that once this new entitlement program kicks in, it's not going away. It's a one-way ratchet. You've got death, taxes, and entitlements. Once created, they don't go away. And to answer the second part of that question, I'm not aware of any plan among any Republican, aside from this one, aside from the plan that says, don't fund Obamacare, fund government, but not Obamacare, that would address this issue. I'm not aware of any plan. The only other plan that I'm aware of would be one that says, let's just wait and see what happens. Let's wait and see what a horrible disaster this will be. Let's wait and see how awful this will be for the American people, how utterly intolerable they will find it. And let's just hope that that will provide enough political momentum for us perhaps to win elections at some unknown point in the future. This is not a good way to run a government. This is not a kind thing to do to an unsuspecting public who hopes and expects that we have their best interests at heart. And so, to all those in this body who support Obamacare, this argument might not be all that persuasive to you, although you ought to look at the fact that the President who signed this into law has said that he himself isn't ready, isn't willing, isn't able to enforce and implement the law even-handedly as it was written. And so maybe that ought to give you pause as to whether you fund it. But for those of you in this body who are in fact opposed to Obamacare, I ask you, how can you oppose to be against it and yet fund it? And so I would invite you to consider the possibility that what you're doing in thinking about funding it isn't really where you want to go. Consider what might be said about this. Defund it or own it. If you fund it, you're for it. This law, Mr. President, was enacted without a meaningful opportunity for the members voting on it to read it. 2,700 pages long. After it was enacted into law, it was rewritten. A total of 4 times, twice by the Supreme Court of the United States, twice more by the President of the United States. The President's rewrites came just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court's rewrites over a year ago. But what the President did was acknowledge that this law is not ready for prime time. This law is not ready to implement. This law is not one that he's willing to implement as written. He's going to implement and enforce it selectively, holding hardworking Americans, individuals and families to the fire while throwing a big bone to big business. This, Mr. President, is not acceptable. This, Mr. President, is un-American. This, Mr. President, is not something that those of us who purport to be against Obamacare can support by funding it. And so I invite my colleagues to join me in this cause, to vote to fund government, but not Obamacare. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
even though I disagree with my three friends, I appreciate their sincerity, their advocacy. They're all three very intelligent men, good senators. But I'm going to move on to another subject. I ask unanimous consent that following Senator Colburn's remarks, which are 15 minutes as I understand it, that all, and he'll speak next, that all post-cloture time in calendar number 223 be yielded back and the Senate proceed to vote on confirmation of the nomination with no intervening action or debate. Further, that following disposition of calendar number 223, the Senate proceed to consideration of the following nominations in block: 224, 104, 102, and 103. Further, there be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to cloture votes on calendar number 224 and 104, that if cloture is invoked on the nomination, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate proceed to vote on confirmation of the nomination with no intervening action or debate. Further, that if calendar number 223, 224, and 104 are confirmed, that the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on calendar number 102 and 103 in that order. That if cloture is not invoked on calendar number 224 or 104, calendar number 102 and 103 be returned to the calendar. Further, if a nomination is confirmed, the motion be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, no further motions be in order. Any related statements be printed in the record. That President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Further, that upon confirmation of calendar number 103, the Senate resume legislative session, and that all after the first vote be 10 minutes in duration.
Is there objection?